Eleanor Whitmore, a sharp 72-year-old widow, faces a chilling betrayal in her grand estate. Her son-in-law, Marcus, and daughter Sarah move in, but Marcus's charm hides a sinister plot. Subtly isolating Eleanor, he undermines her autonomy, gaslights her, and plans to commit her to a psychiatric facility to seize her fortune. As his manipulations deepen, Eleanor uncovers his financial desperation and dangerous intentions. With time running out, she activates her late husband's secret protections, setting a trap for Marcus. Will her cunning outmatch his cruelty, or will his deadly backup plan succeed? The stakes couldn't be higher. If Eleanor's gripping tale of betrayal and resilience moved you, join our community. Subscribe to our channel for more thrilling stories and share where you're tuning in from. Your support fuels our storytelling. Don't miss tomorrow's special reveal. Click now and stay part of the journey. At 72, Eleanor Whitmore thought she'd seen betrayal in every form. Ruthless business competitors, envious friends who whispered behind manicured smiles, subtle slights at glittering social events. But the deepest betrayal, the kind that hollows you out and leaves you questioning your own reality, came not from strangers, but from the family she held closest. For 3 years, she endured a daily charade of affection laced with contempt, a slow poison administered by her daughter Sarah and son-in-law Marcus. Their smiles were flawless, their words, to others, but to her, every glance carried a veiled disdain, every kind gesture a calculated move in a game she hadn't yet deciphered. 3 years ago, on a quiet October afternoon, Eleanor stood in her garden, her hands, worn by time but steady with purpose, pruning the roses her late husband Thomas had planted to mark their 40th anniversary. The October sun warmed her skin, each snip of her shears a tender dialogue with Thomas, whose memory lingered in every petal. He'd taught her that roses demanded discipline to reach their fullest bloom, a metaphor she now saw stretched far beyond the soil. The Whitmore estate, a grand 43-room mansion set amidst meticulously tended grounds, had been their shared legacy, born from Thomas's relentless drive and her quiet strength. Its halls had echoed with the clink of glasses at charity balls, the murmur of high-stakes deals, and the joy of Sarah's wedding. But since Thomas's death 2 years earlier, the silence had grown suffocating, the vast rooms filled with memories that weighed heavier than comforted. Eleanor, a widow alone, felt like a ghost in her own home, her footsteps swallowed by the emptiness. The sound of tires on the circular gravel drive snapped her from her reverie. Sarah, her 45-year-old daughter, stepped out first, her chestnut hair catching the sunlight in a warm cascade of browns. Even at her age now, Sarah moved with the eager, almost childlike bounce she'd had as a girl, her energy a spark that could light up a room. Eleanor's chest swelled with a mother's pride, a fleeting reprieve from her sorrow. Behind her came Marcus, his tailored suit crisp, his smile wide but too perfect, his gaze sweeping over the estate with a surveyor's precision. They were moving in, a plan sparked by Sarah's suggestion that Eleanor might find joy with family nearby. To her, it had seemed a godsend, a way to fill the loneliness that had settled into her marrow since Thomas's passing. "Mother, you have to see what Marcus has planned for the East Wing," Sarah called, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm as she looped her arm through her husband's. Just over a year into their marriage, Sarah looked at Marcus with an adoration that bordered on worship, as if he'd hung the stars and sculpted the moon for her alone. Marcus approached with a commanding air, his handshake firm, his eyes meeting Eleanor's with a directness that felt more performative than sincere. "Mrs. Whitmore, Sarah and I are deeply grateful for you welcoming us into your extraordinary home. We promise to care for it, and for you, with the respect it deserves," he said, his voice rich with the kind of authority that had built his real estate empire. His words should have wrapped her in reassurance, the pledge of a devoted son-in-law. But there was a glint in his eyes, a brief, almost imperceptible calculation of the property's worth that stirred a faint unease in her gut. She brushed it aside, scolding herself for her skepticism. Sarah's radiant joy was her North Star, and Marcus seemed to be its source. The early months were everything Eleanor had dared to hope for. Sarah's laughter once again filled the mansion's cavernous spaces, a melody that soothed the raw edges of Thomas's absence. She bustled in the kitchen, rolling out pie crusts and swapping stories as they recreated Thomas's beloved apple pie, their hands dusted with flour, their giggles echoing with the shared nostalgia. Marcus played the dutiful son-in-law flawlessly, inquiring about her day, lending a hand with minor chores, and drawing her into their discussions about future plans with an ease that felt genuine. At their dinner parties, he introduced her to his colleagues with a grand gesture. Eleanor Whitmore, the extraordinary woman who helped forge this legacy. His admiration seemed heartfelt, and Eleanor allowed herself to sink into the comfort of family unity, believing she'd found a new season of contentment. But the shifts came so subtly she questioned her own perception. Marcus began suggesting, always with Sarah present, that the estate's sprawling rooms were too much for Eleanor to oversee alone. "The main staircase could be tough on you at your age," he'd say, his voice thick with feigned worry. "We just want to keep you safe, Mother," Sarah would add, her eyes brimming with concern as she clasped Eleanor's hand. When Eleanor countered that she'd managed the stairs for over 30 years without trouble, Marcus rattled off statistics about elderly falls, his reasoned tone making her objections feel childish. Defeated, she agreed to relocate to the guest wing, convincing herself it was a minor compromise for family peace. Yet the move left her adrift, a stranger in the home she'd poured her life into. Next, Marcus's suggestion to simplify household management felt like another practical step, but it carried a deeper intent. "You shouldn't have to deal with coordinating staff at your age, Eleanor," he said over a family dinner, his smile paternalistic. "Let me take on the gardeners and cleaners so you can truly relax." The idea sounded sensible, but the following day, Margaret, the housekeeper who'd served for 15 years, sought Eleanor out in the kitchen, her lined face taut with worry. "Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Marcus has been asking about your personal routines. When you sleep, when you walk, who comes by, it doesn't feel right." Eleanor thanked her, offering reassurance, but Margaret's warning took root, a quiet alarm blooming in her. Isolation descended slowly, a creeping fog that enveloped her life. Friends who once visited regularly faded away, their calls ceasing. Marcus claimed he was filtering calls to shield her from fraudsters, his solicitude so polished she almost bought it. Her cherished bridge club gatherings stopped, and when she pressed Sarah for answers, her daughter looked bewildered. "Marcus said you found them draining, Mother. You wanted to rest." Eleanor's denials were met with Marcus's seamless interruption. "You were so worn out after those sessions, maybe you forgot." Sarah's soft, "You've seemed so tired lately," planted doubts in Eleanor's mind. Had she misspoken? Was her memory faltering? Thomas had always called her mind a steel trap, but now she wasn't certain. When alone with Marcus, his mask slipped. His tone grew curt when she inquired about household matters, his sighs heavy with exasperation when she asked to see financial records. One afternoon in Thomas's old study, surrounded by trophies of their shared triumphs, his composure fractured. "Letting go is tough, Eleanor, but you need to trust us. Your endless questions aren't helping anyone," he said, his voice treating her like a petulant child rather than the woman who owned the estate. The rebuke should have roused her, but her devotion to Sarah and her own self-doubt kept her tethered to his narrative. The revelation struck at one of Marcus's opulent dinner parties. Dressed in her emerald gown, Thomas's pearl necklace at her throat, Eleanor descended the grand staircase, eager to join the lively hum of guests. The mansion gleamed, every detail flawless, flowers vibrant, her crystal sparkling. Marcus stood by the fireplace, regaling his associates with a story that drew laughter. As she approached, she caught his words. "Caring for elderly kin is a challenge, but Sarah and I are committed to family. Eleanor's fortunate, we've ensured her comfort in her waning years." The casual scorn in his voice struck her like a blow, recasting her as a pitiable dependent they'd rescued. A guest noticed her, smiling warmly. "Eleanor, you're radiant tonight." Marcus turned, and for a fleeting instant, irritation crossed his face before his smile snapped back. "Our dear Eleanor," he said, his hand on her shoulder squeezing too tightly, a veiled admonition cloaked in warmth. The guest nodded, accepting his story, oblivious to the truth, that they stood in her home, built by her and Thomas's labor. Later, as he poured a drink from Thomas's decanter, Eleanor broached the subject. I was taken aback by how you framed our living situation. His response was clipped. You misheard. I was emphasizing family duty. When she pushed back, his glass struck the table. Let's be clear, Eleanor. We moved here to look after you because you were floundering after Thomas's death. We've put our lives on hold. If you stay, you need to respect our decisions. The audacity of his lie that they'd sacrifice for her, not leapt at the estate's grandeur, left her reeling. That night, sleep fled her. In the guest room's dim stillness, she stared at the ceiling, grappling with her diminished existence. How had Eleanor Whitmore, co-architect of a business empire, become a silenced guest in her own home? Dawn brought clarity. She hadn't chosen this. She'd been ensnared, her trust twisted against her. The weeks that followed piled on small humiliations. Marcus corrected her in front of Sarah, claiming she garbled facts. He diverted guests, citing her frailty. The breaking point came when Catherine Morrison, her friend of 40 years, called. In the kitchen, Eleanor's voice wavered as she admitted, I've lost my life, Catherine. Marcus controls everything. The confession laid bare her shame of a woman unraveled. The weight of Marcus's presence in my home had grown heavier with each passing day, like a storm cloud that refused to break. His belief that he knew what was best for me, better than I knew myself, gnawed at my spirit, a quiet insult wrapped in his smug certainty. I sat in the kitchen that morning, the familiar scent of coffee mingling with the sharp tang of my growing unease, as I poured my heart out to Catherine Morrison over the phone. My voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the frustration of having to explain the slow, deliberate erosion of my world. I told her about the isolation, how Marcus had subtly, systematically cut me off from my friends, my routines, my very sense of self. I described the way he'd stripped me of authority in my own home, reducing my voice to a whisper in matters that had once been mine to command. And worst of all, I confided how he spoke about me to others, painting me as fragile, confused, a burden to be managed rather than a woman with a lifetime of strength and wisdom. Each word felt like a rebellion, a spark of the fire that still burned inside me, despite Marcus's efforts to smother it. But as I spoke, the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway sent a jolt of panic through me. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that screamed of betrayal. They weren't supposed to be back yet. Catherine, I need to go, I whispered, my voice tight with urgency. But the words barely left my lips before Marcus appeared in the doorway. His face was a storm of its own, dark and foreboding, his eyes glinting with barely restrained anger. The air in the room thickened, charged with a tension that made my skin prickle. He didn't speak until I'd hung up the phone, but his silence was louder than any words could have been, a heavy, oppressive force that seemed to press me into the floor. Who were you talking to, Eleanor? His voice was low, deliberate, each syllable laced with a menace that made my throat tighten. Catherine Morrison called to check on me, I replied, forcing my voice to stay steady, though my hands betrayed me with a slight tremble as I set the phone down. And what did you tell her? His question was deceptively calm, but I knew that tone too well. It was the calm before the storm, the kind that promised consequences if I didn't tread carefully. We were just catching up, I said, meeting his gaze despite the fear curling in my chest. I hated how small I felt under his scrutiny, how his presence seemed to shrink the room around me. Really? He said, stepping closer, his voice dripping with skepticism. Because from what I overheard, it sounded like you were telling her some very troubling things about your life here. My mouth went dry. The words I wanted to say caught in my throat like thorns. I was just explaining why I haven't been able to see her as much lately. I managed, but even to my own ears, the excuse sounded weak, defensive. Marcus took another step forward, and I instinctively backed toward the counter, the cold edge pressing against my spine. Eleanor, we need to have a serious conversation about your behavior, he said, his tone shifting to one of exaggerated concern, the kind that made my stomach churn. You've been increasingly paranoid, combative even. You're making up stories about how Sarah and I treat you, and now you're spreading these delusions to your friends. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. But it was the word delusions that ignited something deep within me. A spark of the old Eleanor, the woman who had built a life with Thomas through sheer will and determination. They're not delusions, I said, my voice steady now, fueled by a defiance I hadn't felt in months. You've been controlling and manipulative. You've isolated me from my friends, from my life. Marcus shook his head, his expression one of practiced sadness, as if he were dealing with a wayward child. Listen to yourself, Eleanor. These are exactly the kind of paranoid thoughts that come with declining mental faculties. Sarah and I have been discussing this, and we think it might be time to consider additional support for you. The threat was clear, even wrapped in his carefully chosen words. Additional support wasn't about care, it was about control. It meant doctors, medications, perhaps even a facility where I'd be tucked away, out of sight, out of the way. My heart raced at the thought, not with fear, but with a growing resolve. He thought he could break me, convince Sarah I was losing my mind. But he didn't know the strength I still carried, the fire that had been banked but never extinguished. Where is Sarah? I demanded, my voice sharp. I want to talk to her about this. Sarah's running errands, Marcus replied smoothly, his eyes never leaving mine. But we've already discussed your recent behavior extensively. She's as concerned as I am about these episodes you've been having. Episodes. The word was a knife twisting in my gut. He was framing my resistance, my justified anger, as symptoms of a failing mind. Every protest I made, every attempt to assert myself was twisted into evidence of my supposed decline. The injustice of it burned, but I swallowed my retort. Confronting him now would only play into his hands, giving him more ammunition to use against me. That night, as the house settled into an uneasy silence, I made a decision that felt like reclaiming a piece of self. I waited until Marcus's snoring echoed from the master bedroom, a room that had once been my sanctuary with Thomas, now stolen by a man who saw me as an obstacle. With the stealth of someone reclaiming their own power, I crept down the hallway to Thomas's study, the one corner of the house Marcus hadn't yet tainted with his presence. The door creaked softly as I slipped inside, and the familiar scent of old books and leather enveloped me like a warm embrace. I sank into Thomas's chair, surrounded by photographs of our life together. Smiling faces, shared triumphs, moments of love frozen in time. My fingers brushed the armrests, and for a moment, I could almost feel him there, whispering encouragement, reminding me who I was. I wasn't ready to confront Marcus outright, nor did I want a dramatic showdown that would only fuel his narrative of my instability. No, my plan was subtler, more strategic, born of the patience and cunning Thomas had always admired in me. If Marcus wanted to play games of manipulation, he was about to meet an opponent who had spent decades mastering strategy. I pulled out the small notebook I'd kept hidden in a drawer, its pages filled with names and numbers Marcus didn't know existed. My attorney, my financial advisor, the private investigator Thomas had trusted for business matters, and a handful of others who knew the real Eleanor Whitmore. These were people who remembered the woman who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Thomas, building an empire from nothing, navigating challenges with a sharp mind and an unyielding spirit. As I wrote, my thoughts drifted to the roses in my garden, the ones Thomas and I had tended together. He taught me that sometimes, to save the plant, you had to prune away the diseased parts, no matter how painful the cut. I'd been patient with Marcus, gentle, accommodating, hoping he'd prove himself worthy of the trust I'd placed in him as Sarah's husband. But he'd shown his true colors, and it was time to start pruning. First, I needed to understand the full scope of what I was up against. Over the next few days, I became a silent observer in my own home, watching Marcus's patterns with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. I noted the times he slipped away for hushed phone calls, the names he mentioned, the strangers who came to the house for meetings he never explained. I began keeping a detailed record in my notebook. Every lie he told Sarah about me, every subtle power grab, every moment he overstepped in what he believed was his domain. What I uncovered was both more alarming and less surprising than I'd expected. Marcus wasn't just a controlling son-in-law who'd overreached his authority. He was a man drowning in debt, his business ventures crumbling under the weight of his own ambition. The real estate deals he bragged about were smoke and mirrors, propped up by loans and lies, a house of cards waiting to collapse. More unsettling was the way he watched me, his casual questions about my health, my medications, My daily routines felt less like concern and more like a predator sizing up its prey. The pieces began to form a chilling picture. Marcus hadn't married Sarah solely for love, nor had he moved into our home for convenience. He was playing a long game, one where my dependence and eventual absence was a critical part of his plan. But Marcus had made a fatal mistake. He assumed my age, my grief, my quiet demeanor made me weak. He mistook my kindness for fragility, my trust for naivety. Thomas used to say the most dangerous opponents were those who underestimated you, who saw your restraint as a lack of strength. Sitting in his study, surrounded by the legacy we'd built together, I felt that truth settle into my bones. Marcus was about to learn just how wrong he'd been. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught my reflection in the guest bathroom mirror. The woman staring back was older, her face etched with the lines of a life fully lived. But her eyes burned with the same fire that had carried her through decades of challenges, business failures, personal losses, moments when the world seemed determined to break her. Marcus thought he was playing chess with a confused old woman, someone who'd forgotten the rules. He didn't realize he was facing a grandmaster who'd been studying the board while he reveled in his small victories. The game was about to shift, and I held pieces he didn't even know existed. Patience, I reminded myself, echoing Thomas's wisdom. The best victories were the ones your opponent never saw coming. Marcus had spent months dismantling my life, isolating me, painting me as a burden. Now it was my turn to show him the consequences of underestimating Eleanor Whitmore. The real game had just begun. Over the following weeks, Marcus's mask began to slip, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the polished facade. Where he'd once cloaked his control in respectful concern, now there were moments of raw frustration, flashes of the truth he couldn't always hide. It started with small things, moments Sarah either missed or chose to ignore. One morning, as I sat in the morning room with my coffee and newspaper, a ritual I'd cherished for 30 years, Marcus stormed in, already dressed in one of his tailored suits, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice carried a desperate edge as he spoke about a business deal, his free hand gesturing wildly. "No, I understand the timeline," he said, pacing by the windows. "I just need another month, maybe 2. The property situation will be resolved soon, and then we can move forward." The phrase property situation sent a chill through me, a vague but ominous hint of his plans. When he ended the call and noticed me sitting there, his expression shifted from strained to hostile. "How long have you been sitting there, eavesdropping on my private conversation?" he snapped, his voice sharp enough to make me flinch. "I wasn't eavesdropping," I said, setting my coffee cup down with a steadiness I didn't feel. "I was having my morning coffee, as I do every day. In the future, perhaps you could choose a different location when I'm conducting business calls," he said, his tone dismissive, as if I were an inconvenience in my own home. "Some conversations require privacy." The audacity of it sparked a fire in me, one I'd been trying to keep banked. "Marcus, this is the morning room," I said, my voice firm. "I've had my coffee here every morning for 30 years. Perhaps you could take your private call in the study or your bedroom." His face darkened, and for the first time I felt a flicker of genuine fear. "My bedroom?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Eleanor, I think you're forgetting that this is Sarah's and my home now. We've been more than generous in allowing you to stay here, but that doesn't give you the right to dictate where I conduct my business." The words hit me like a slap, stealing my breath. Allowing me to stay in my own home, the home Thomas and I had built, filled with love and memories paid for with our sweat and sacrifice. Before I could respond, Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face creased with concern. "What's going on?" she asked, looking between us. Marcus's demeanor shifted instantly, the storm in his eyes replaced by a mask of calm. "Nothing serious, darling," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Your mother and I were just having a small disagreement about household routines. I think she may be having one of those confused episodes again." Sarah's eyes filled with worry as she turned to me. "Mother, are you feeling all right? You've seemed a bit disoriented lately." "I'm not disoriented," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I was simply pointing out that I've always had my coffee in this room." "Of course you have," Sarah said, her tone soothing, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. "No one's saying you can't. Marcus was probably just looking for a quiet space for his work calls. You know how stressful his business has been lately. Her patronizing kindness stung worse than Marcus's hostility. His contempt was honest, raw. Sarah's pity felt like a betrayal, soft and insidious. I understand perfectly, I said, rising from my chair with as much dignity as I could muster. I'll leave you both to discuss whatever arrangements you need to make. As I walked toward the door, I heard Marcus murmur to Sarah, "She's getting worse, honey. Maybe we should talk to Dr. Peterson about adjusting her medication or exploring additional support options." The phrase additional support hung in the air like a guillotine, a thinly veiled threat that made my blood run cold. I paused in the hallway, gripping the doorframe as I overheard Sarah agree that it might be time to get me some help. After that day, the isolation tightened like a noose. Phone calls were no longer just screened, they were blocked entirely. When I asked to call Catherine or other friends, Marcus claimed the phone system was being updated or the line was down. My cell phone, which I'd given him to repair weeks ago, was still at the shop, the delay always just a little longer than expected. My mail, once delivered directly to me, now passed through Marcus's hands for security purposes. He explained that elderly people were vulnerable to scams, and he was merely protecting me. When I asked to see my correspondence, he'd hand me a stack of junk mail, claiming anything else had been suspicious and discarded. The most maddening part was how reasonable he made it all sound. Every restriction was framed as care, every limitation as protection. In Sarah's presence, he played the devoted son-in-law, his concern for my safety so convincing that even I sometimes wondered if I was overreacting. "Your mother's safety is our top priority," he'd tell Sarah, his arm around her as he painted himself as the selfless caretaker. Given her increasing confusion and the concerning things she's been saying, we need to be vigilant. My protests that I wasn't confused, that I was being systematically controlled, only fed his narrative, each objection twisted into proof of my supposed decline. But it was Margaret, our loyal housekeeper of 15 years, who confirmed my worst fears. She'd always been warm, a steady presence in the house. But lately she avoided my gaze, her responses clipped and nervous. One afternoon I found her in the laundry room, away from prying ears. "Margaret, is something wrong?" I asked, my voice soft but firm. "You seem uncomfortable around me." She hesitated, her hands pausing over the linen she was folding, her face etched with worry. "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't want to speak out of turn, but Mr. Marcus has given us specific instructions about your care." "What kind of instructions?" I pressed, my heart sinking. She glanced at the door, then leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. "He's told us you've been having memory problems, that we should report to him if you seem confused or ask us to do anything unusual. He said you might try to pass messages to people outside the house, and we should bring them to him because it could be part of your illness." The cruelty of it stole my breath. Marcus had turned my own staff into spies, convincing them that helping me was enabling a delusion. Even Margaret, who'd known me for years, looked at me with pity now, not trust. "Margaret, I'm not ill," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "I'm being controlled, isolated. If I ask for your help, it's because I'm in trouble." But the doubt in her eyes told me Marcus's lies had taken root. "Maybe you should talk to Miss Sarah," she said, her voice gentle but uncertain. "She loves you and just wants what's best." Sarah, my daughter, who'd been so thoroughly manipulated that she saw my resistance as a symptom rather than a cry for help. How could I make her see the truth when Marcus had woven such a convincing web of lies? That evening, as we sat at the formal dining table, I resolved to try. The clink of silverware against plates was the only sound breaking the tense silence. Sarah's eyes darted between Marcus and me, her worry palpable. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Sarah, we need to talk about what's been happening," I began, my voice calm but firm. "I'm not confused or unwell. I'm being systematically cut off from my life, my friends, my decisions, my independence, and Marcus is orchestrating it." Sarah's fork froze halfway to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Marcus's expression didn't change, but his grip on his wine glass tightened. "Eleanor, I know you're upset," he said, his voice smooth as ever, "but these accusations are exactly why we're so concerned. You're not yourself." "I am myself," I said. my voice rising despite my efforts to stay composed. And I'm tired of being treated like I'm losing my mind when all I'm doing is fighting to hold on to who I am. Sarah reached for my hand, her touch gentle but heavy with pity. Mother, we just want to help you. Marcus and I have been talking, and we think maybe a doctor could. No, I cut her off, pulling my hand away. I don't need a doctor. I need you to listen to me, Sarah. Really listen. But the look in her eyes, love mixed with doubt, told me Marcus's narrative had already won. The meal continued in silence, my heart heavy with the realization that the battle ahead would be fought alone. But I wasn't defeated. Not yet. The game was far from over, and I was ready to play. Eleanor sat at the dinner table, her heart heavy with a mix of frustration and determination. The meal, meticulously prepared by Margaret to adhere to Marcus's strict dietary guidelines, sat untouched before her. Marcus, her son-in-law, had framed these restrictions as a gesture of care, insisting that precise nutrition was vital for preserving mental clarity in her later years. To him, it was another way to demonstrate his attentiveness, but to Eleanor, it felt like another chain tightening around her shrinking world. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she prepared to voice the concerns that had been gnawing at her for weeks. Sarah, she began, her voice measured but trembling with the weight of suppressed emotion. I need to talk to you about how things are being handled here. Sarah, her daughter, looked up from her plate, her fork pausing as her eyes met Eleanor's with immediate concern. Marcus, sitting across the table, froze mid-bite, his fork hovering as his gaze sharpened, assessing her. Of course, Mother, Sarah said softly, her tone warm but cautious. What's troubling you? Eleanor's chest tightened as she searched for the right words, words that could pierce through the carefully constructed narrative Marcus had woven. I feel like I've lost all control over my own life, she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within. I can't make a phone call without it being monitored. My mail doesn't reach me unless it's been opened and sorted first. I can't even have a private moment with Margaret without it being reported back to Marcus. I know you both mean well, but this isn't help, it's suffocating. It's like I'm a prisoner in my own home. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth and pain. Eleanor watched Sarah's face, hoping for understanding, but saw a flicker of doubt instead. Sarah reached across the table, her hand warm and gentle as it closed over Eleanor's. Mother, no one wants you to feel trapped, she said, her voice thick with emotion. We're just trying to keep you safe, to make sure you're cared for properly. Eleanor's heart sank. Safe. Cared for. These were the words Marcus used to justify his control, and now Sarah was echoing them. Sarah, I'm not an invalid, Eleanor said, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to stay calm. I'm 72, not 92. My mind is as sharp as ever. These restrictions aren't protecting me. They're cutting me off from the world, from the things that make my life worth living. Marcus set his fork down with deliberate care, leaning back in his chair. His expression was a masterclass in feigned patience, his eyes soft with concern but sharp with calculation. Eleanor, he said, his voice smooth as silk. I think you're seeing malice where there's only care. Every step we've taken, every precaution, has been discussed and agreed upon because we're worried about your safety and well-being. Eleanor's stomach churned at his words. Discussed and agreed upon? When was I part of these discussions? She asked, her tone sharp but controlled. When did I agree to have my phone calls screened or my mail filtered? Marcus didn't miss a beat. You were having trouble with scam callers, he said, his voice dripping with sincerity. You told us you were confused by some of the calls you were getting, so we put the screening system in place to protect you. The lie was so seamless, so confidently delivered, that Eleanor saw doubt flicker across Sarah's face. Had she mentioned being confused by phone calls? For a moment, Eleanor questioned herself, her confidence wavering under Marcus's steady gaze. Was her memory slipping? No, she refused to let him plant that seed. And the mail? She pressed, her voice firmer now. You said it was because I was misplacing important documents. I've been handling my own correspondence for decades without issue. I've never misplaced anything important. Sarah's brow furrowed, her hand still resting on Eleanor's. Mother, you did seem confused about some financial documents last month, she said gently. Remember the insurance papers? You couldn't find them, and Marcus spent hours helping you track them down. Eleanor's heart raced as the memory of that incident flooded back, not the way Sarah described it, but the way it had actually happened. Those papers had been exactly where she always kept them, in Thomas's old filing cabinet, meticulously organized as she'd done for years. They only went missing after Marcus offered to organize her documents. When she'd grown frantic, unable to find them, he'd miraculously produced them from a random drawer, acting the hero while she felt foolish for her supposed mistake. Now the truth hit her like a physical blow. It had been a setup, a carefully orchestrated moment to make her doubt herself, to paint her as forgetful and incapable. Those papers were moved, Eleanor said, her voice low but firm, each word deliberate. They were exactly where I always kept them until someone took them and placed them somewhere else. Marcus's eyes flashed with irritation, but his voice remained calm, almost patronizing. Eleanor, are you suggesting someone deliberately moved your papers to confuse you? That sounds like a very paranoid way of thinking. Paranoid, the word landed like a slap, designed to discredit her, to frame her concerns as delusions. Once that label stuck, every valid complaint she had would be dismissed as a symptom of mental instability. I'm not paranoid, she said, her voice trembling with barely contained frustration. I'm trying to understand why my life is being controlled, why I'm being treated like a child who can't be trusted. Sarah squeezed her hand again, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Mother, no one's treating you like a child, she said, her voice breaking. We love you. We're trying to protect you. Maybe we should talk to Dr. Peterson about how you're feeling. Sometimes depression can make things feel more overwhelming than they are. Depression, another label, another way to pathologize her resistance. Eleanor could see the path Marcus was paving. A doctor's visit where he would list her symptoms while she protested her sanity, her protests only reinforcing the narrative of her decline. She excused herself from dinner, her appetite waning, and retreated to her room. Sleep eluded her as she lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. This wasn't just overbearing care or misguided concern. Marcus was orchestrating a campaign to isolate her, to erode her credibility, to make her seem mentally unfit while positioning himself as her savior. But why? What was his goal? If he wanted to live comfortably in her home, he already had that. If he wanted the house after her death, it would naturally pass to Sarah. Then, in the quiet hours of the morning, as dawn's first light crept through the curtains, the answer came to her, chilling her to the core. Marcus wasn't waiting for an inheritance. He needed money now, likely due to some financial trouble he'd kept hidden. Declaring her mentally incompetent would give him power of attorney, access to her accounts, and the ability to liquidate her assets. Once she was locked away in a care facility, labeled with dementia or depression, he could drain the estate, leaving nothing for Sarah but debt and a mortgaged property. The realization was a cold weight in her chest. This wasn't just about control, it was theft. A calculated plan to strip away everything she and Thomas had built for their daughter. But knowing his scheme was one thing, stopping it was another. How could she fight someone who had convinced everyone, even Sarah, that her resistance was proof of her instability? The next morning brought a new violation that confirmed her fears. She woke to find Marcus in her room, standing over her dresser, her jewelry box open. He was inspecting her treasures, gifts from Thomas, heirlooms from her mother, pieces that held her life's memories. With a calculating eye, jotting notes on a pad, her heart pounded as she sat up, clutching her robe. "What are you doing in my room?" she demanded, her voice sharp with outrage. Marcus didn't flinch. "Sarah asked me to inventory your valuables for insurance purposes," he said smoothly, not even bothering to look embarrassed. "Some of these pieces are worth a lot. We just want to ensure they're protected." "Those are my personal belongings," Eleanor snapped, her voice shaking with anger. "You have no right to touch them without my permission." His tone remained infuriatingly calm. "Eleanor, we've discussed this. Sarah and I are handling your financial and legal affairs now. This is just part of keeping everything secure." The audacity of his assumption that her life, her memories, her treasures were now under his control made her feel physically ill. These weren't just valuable items. They were pieces of her heart, tokens of love and loss. "Get out of my room," she said, her voice low and fierce. "Those jewels are mine, and I want you to leave them alone." For the first time, Marcus's mask slipped. His eyes hardened, his voice dropping to a menacing tone. "Listen, old woman, you need to understand something. This house, these jewels, everything belongs to Sarah. I'm trying to make this transition smooth for everyone, but if you keep fighting me, I can make things much harder for you." The threat was clear, and for the first time, Eleanor felt a flicker of fear. This was the real Marcus, not the caring son-in-law, but a man who saw her as an obstacle to his plans. "This house is mine," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Everything here is mine until I decide otherwise." Marcus stepped closer, his eyes cold and unyielding. "That's where you're wrong, Eleanor. Sarah is your heir, so it's all hers eventually. I'm just ensuring a smooth transition while making sure you're cared for. But if you keep being difficult, there are other ways to handle this." The words hung in the air, a thinly veiled threat. "Submit or be removed, whether to a nursing home, a psychiatric facility, or something worse." "Sarah," Eleanor called, her voice rising with urgency. "Sarah, I need you up here now." Marcus's expression shifted back to concern as Sarah's footsteps hurried up the stairs. By the time she appeared, breathless and worried, he was gently closing the jewelry box. "What's wrong, Mother?" Sarah asked, her eyes darting between them. "I found Marcus going through my jewelry without permission," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "When I told him to stop, he threatened me." Sarah's face fell, confusion giving way to pity. "Marcus, why were you looking at Mother's jewelry?" she asked. "I was doing the insurance inventory you asked for," Marcus said, his voice calm and reasonable. "Your mother got upset and misunderstood our conversation as a threat." Sarah turned to Eleanor, her expression soft but patronizing. "Mother, Marcus is just trying to help. You asked last week if we could ensure your valuables were insured, remember?" Eleanor's heart sank. Another lie, another false memory planted in Sarah's mind. "I never asked for that," she said, but she could see the doubt in Sarah's eyes. "We discussed it over breakfast a few days ago," Sarah insisted. "You were worried about Daddy's gifts." The cruelty of using her love for Thomas against her cut deep. Marcus knew exactly how to twist her emotions to make his lies believable. Eleanor spent the rest of the day in her room, not resting but plotting. Every assertion of her independence was framed as confusion, every boundary as resistance to care. His strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. Make her objections seem irrational, her competence a delusion. That evening, she overheard Marcus and Sarah in the hallway, their hushed voices carrying through the quiet house. "She's getting worse, honey," Marcus said, his tone heavy with false concern. "She's becoming paranoid, making accusations. The jewelry incident today, it could be embarrassing if she says these things to others." Sarah's voice wavered. "She seems fine most of the time. Moving her to a care facility feels premature." "Sarah, I love your mother, but we have to face reality," Marcus said. "She needs professional help. There's a place called Sunset Manor, perfect for people with her challenges, paranoid episodes, confusion. She'd have medical care, activities, a better quality of life." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Sunset Manor wasn't a care home. It was a psychiatric facility known for sedating wealthy elderly patients into compliance, stripping them of their rights. "I don't know, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice uncertain. "It feels like giving up on her." "It's not giving up, it's helping her," Marcus countered. "And we'd maintain the house, keep everything as she'd want it. She could visit when she's stable." Visits to her own home. The audacity was staggering, but it revealed his plan: lock her away, seize control of the estate, and leave Sarah with nothing but debt. That night, Eleanor decided she was done being a victim. Marcus thought he was outsmarting a frail old woman, but he was about to face a strategist who had spent decades navigating life's challenges. She would fight back, but first, she needed to uncover the resources at her disposal. The next morning, while Marcus and Sarah were out, Eleanor slipped into Thomas's study. She hadn't touched his files since his death, but now she searched through them, her heart pounding with hope and fear. What she found there sparked a memory she'd nearly forgotten, a hidden asset Marcus didn't know existed. a lifeline that could turn the tide in her favor. In the midst of my sorrow and the relentless turmoil of the past year, I found myself grappling with a reality that was both empowering and terrifying. Thomas and I hadn't merely been successful entrepreneurs. We had amassed a fortune that dwarfed the imaginations of most. The estate Marcus so desperately sought to control was a labyrinth of wealth, its true value far exceeding even my own estimations. Thomas, with his meticulous foresight, had woven a tapestry of financial instruments and legal fortifications so intricate that a small-time schemer like Marcus could never hope to unravel it. More than that, I uncovered something profound. Thomas had anticipated a threat like Marcus. In the final months of his life, haunted by the specter of my vulnerability, he had worked tirelessly with our attorneys to construct an impenetrable shield around me, a private trust that Marcus couldn't touch, no matter how cunningly he maneuvered for power of attorney. The man who thought he was preying on a defenseless widow was, in truth, attempting to swindle one of the state's wealthiest women, utterly unaware of the formidable resources and connections he was about to confront. As I sat in Thomas's leather-bound chair, enveloped by the legacy of the empire we had built together, a surge of something long dormant stirred within me. Power. Not the fleeting kind born of fleeting victories, but a deep, unyielding strength backed by wealth, legal acumen, and decades of relationships with influential figures who could make Marcus's life a living nightmare if they so chose. He thought he could manipulate me, isolate me from my allies, and turn my own daughter against me. He believed he could strip away everything Thomas and I had created, leaving me drugged and docile in some psychiatric ward. But he was about to discover that his game was played on a board he didn't understand, with rules he couldn't comprehend. The gentle, grieving widow he had tormented was transforming into his most formidable adversary. Yet, I reminded myself, patience was key. The trap had to be flawless, for I would have only one chance to spring it. The morning sun spilled through the tall windows, casting long shadows across Thomas's mahogany desk as I spread out the documents that held the key to my counterattack. 3 years of meticulous legal planning lay before me, each folder a testament to the fortress Thomas had erected around our wealth. His protectiveness, which I had once found excessive, had bordered on paranoia in his final days. "Eleanor," he had said during one of our last heartfelt conversations, his voice heavy with urgency, "I've seen too many widows destroyed by those they trusted, men who marry for money, children who see their parents as obstacles, advisors who prey on the elderly. I won't leave you exposed to that." At the time, I had dismissed his fears as overblown. Sarah, our devoted daughter, would surely marry someone who cherished me as family. How painfully naive I had been, blind to the sophisticated cruelty Marcus would unleash upon our lives. But Thomas's foresight was my salvation. The documents revealed a complex network of trusts, offshore accounts, and legal structures that placed our fortune beyond the reach of anyone seeking to exploit me through guardianship or coercion. Even if Marcus succeeded in having me declared incompetent, he would find the assets he coveted locked behind barriers he couldn't breach. More crucially, Thomas had devised an emergency protocol, a mechanism that allowed me to activate protective measures if I ever felt threatened. A single phone call to our trusted attorney, Jonathan Hartwell, using a specific code phrase, would set in motion a series of actions to investigate and neutralize any danger. The irony was almost poetic. Marcus's efforts to portray me as mentally unfit required me to demonstrate my clarity and resolve to activate the very protections that would dismantle his plans. I memorized Jonathan's private number and the code phrase, then carefully concealed the documents behind Thomas's collection of first edition books. Marcus had shown interest in the study, but his greed fixated on obvious valuables, oblivious to the legal papers that held true power. The challenge now was timing. I needed concrete evidence of Marcus's intentions before acting, for once I triggered Thomas's protocol, there would be no turning back. The legal machinery was designed to be thorough and unstoppable, a nuclear option for dire circumstances. Over the next few days, I became a silent observer, meticulously tracking Marcus's movements for signs of his desperation and scheme. Late one evening, feigning a quiet night of reading in my room, I crept down the hallway to eavesdrop outside the study where Marcus was engrossed in one of his frequent, secretive phone calls. The door was slightly ajar, and his voice, laced with barely concealed panic, carried clearly. "I get your frustration, but this is more complicated than we thought," he said, his tone taut with strain. "The old woman's tougher than we expected, and Sarah's starting to waver on the care facility plan." A pause followed as the other party responded. Then Marcus's voice grew more desperate. "No, I can't just wait for her to die naturally. The creditors are hounding me, and if I don't get the money soon, it's over. We need to move faster." My blood ran cold as the reality of his words sank in. He was discussing my fate with an accomplice, someone as invested in my downfall as he was. This wasn't just a family betrayal. It was a conspiracy involving outsiders with financial stakes in my institutionalization. "The property's worth at least $12 million, probably more," Marcus continued, his voice dripping with greed. "Once I have guardianship, I can mortgage it to clear the debts and still have plenty left for our deal. But we need her out of the way in the next 2 weeks, or we're all screwed." 12 million, a number that struck me not because it was inaccurate, but because it was a gross underestimate. The estate, when fully valued, was closer to 30 million, revealing the depth of Marcus's financial desperation. A man that cornered was capable of anything, but his next words sent a shiver of terror through me. If the psychiatric route takes too long, we might need to explore more direct solutions. An elderly woman alone in a big house, accidents happen. A fall down the stairs, a bad reaction to medication. Tragic, but not unheard of. The casual malice in his tone weakened my knees. Marcus wasn't just planning to rob me. He was contemplating my murder if his other schemes failed. I stumbled back to my room, collapsing onto the bed as I fought to steady my breathing. The man sleeping just down the hall, the man my daughter loved, was plotting to kill me if I didn't comply with his plans. The next morning brought a chilling confirmation of the urgency. Sarah entered my room, her eyes red-rimmed, her forced cheerfulness betraying recent tears. "Mother, Marcus and I have been talking," she said, her voice trembling with a false optimism. "We think it might be good for you to spend some time at a specialized care facility where professionals can help with the confusion and anxiety you have been experiencing." I looked at my daughter, the woman I had raised, loved, and sacrificed for, and saw a stranger so thoroughly manipulated that she believed she was saving me by condemning me to a prison of Marcus's design. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady despite the storm within, "I'm not confused or anxious. Your husband is isolating me, undermining me, and I'm trying to make you see the danger we're all in." Her face crumpled, a mix of pity and frustration. "Mother, please, not these paranoid accusations again. Marcus has been so patient with you. These conspiracy theories are exactly why you need help." The phrase "professional help" made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to remain calm. "What kind of facility?" I asked. "It's called Sunset Manor," she replied, her voice softening as if the name alone was reassuring. "They specialize in caring for elderly people with issues like yours. Paranoid thoughts, memory problems." Sunset Manor. The name confirmed my worst fears. Once admitted, Marcus would have free rein to plunder our assets, mortgage the estate, and destroy everything Thomas and I had built. By the time anyone noticed, I'd be sedated and legally powerless. "When would this happen?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice even. "We've scheduled an intake evaluation for Friday morning. If it goes well, you could be settled in by the weekend." Friday, it was Tuesday, leaving me less than 3 days to activate Thomas's protocol and gather the evidence to stop Marcus. "And the house?" I pressed, watching her closely. "What happens to it while I'm getting this help?" Sarah's eyes flickered with uncertainty, a sign she hadn't fully thought this through. "Marcus will handle maintenance and make sure everything's taken care of until you're better." Until I'm better, as if I'd ever be released once Marcus had control, as if there'd be anything left to return to after he'd liquidated everything to pay his debts. "Sarah," I said, my voice firm, "this house, our assets, everything your father and I built, it doesn't belong to Marcus. If something happens to me, you're my sole heir. He has no legal right to manage or sell anything." Her innocence was heartbreaking. "Of course, Mother, Marcus isn't trying to take anything. He's just helping while you're unwell. You're acting like he's trying to steal from us." The depth of her delusion, crafted by Marcus's manipulations, was a dagger to my heart. That afternoon, while Sarah and Marcus were out arranging my care, I made the call that would set my plan in motion. Jonathan Hartwell answered on the second ring, his familiar voice a lifeline. "Eleanor, it's good to hear from you. How are you holding up?" "Jonathan, I need to activate Thomas's emergency protocol. Code phrase, the roses need pruning before winter sets in." A brief silence followed. Then his voice sharpened with focus. "Understood. The protocol is active. Can you speak freely?" "Yes," I said, my voice trembling with urgency. "Jonathan, I'm in danger. My son-in-law is planning to have me committed to a psychiatric facility to seize the estate. He's in deep financial trouble and has been isolating me to make the commitment seem justified. They've scheduled an evaluation for Friday at Sunset Manor. Once I'm there, he'll liquidate assets to pay his debts. And I have reason to believe that if this doesn't work, he's considering more direct methods." Jonathan's sharp intake of breath told me he grasped the gravity of the situation. "Eleanor, I'm activating the full emergency response now. Investigators will start digging into Marcus within the hour, and I'll file for an emergency restraining order to block any involuntary commitment." "What about Sarah?" "She's been completely deceived," I said, my voice breaking. "She thinks she's helping me. We'll handle this delicately to protect her while safeguarding you and the estate," Jonathan assured me. "The investigators will focus on Marcus's finances and any evidence of fraud or conspiracy. Once we have proof, we'll present it to Sarah carefully." "There's more," I added. I overheard him discussing direct options, accidents, medication reactions, if the commitment fails. The silence was heavy. Then Jonathan's voice returned, hard and resolute. "I'm sending a security team to the house tonight. They'll be discreet, posing as estate maintenance consultants. Marcus won't suspect a thing." The call ended, and I felt a volatile mix of fear and exhilaration. The wheels were turning, but the next few days would be the most perilous of my life. Marcus was cunning. Any shift in my demeanor could tip him off. I had to continue playing the frail, confused widow while Jonathan's team gathered evidence. That evening at dinner, I forced myself to appear broken and compliant. "Sarah," I said softly, "I've been thinking about what you said. Maybe you're right at home about the care facility. If you and Marcus think it's best, I'm willing to consider it." Sarah's face lit up with relief. "Oh, Mother, I'm so glad you're being reasonable. I know it's scary, but it's for the best." Marcus leaned back, his smug satisfaction palpable. "Eleanor, I'm proud of you for this decision. It takes strength to admit you need help, and we'll ensure you're comfortable." His patronizing tone made my stomach churn, but I managed a weak smile. "I suppose I have been struggling. Maybe professional help would help." "Absolutely," he said, patting my hand, a gesture that felt like a predator claiming its prey. "Don't worry about the house. I'll take excellent care of everything while you focus on getting better." "I'll bet you will," I thought, keeping my expression meek. The next morning, Jonathan's protocol bore fruit. 3 men in sharp suits arrived, introducing themselves as security consultants assessing the estate's vulnerabilities. Marcus greeted them with the confidence of a man who believed he was on the verge of inheriting everything. "Gentlemen, I appreciate the thoroughness," he said, "but Mrs. Whitmore will soon transition to a care facility, so the focus should be on securing the property when it's unoccupied." The lead consultant, a silver-haired man with piercing eyes, nodded. "Of course, sir, we'll address all scenarios. Will you and your wife be the primary residents?" "Yes," Marcus replied, oblivious to the trap tightening around him. "We're committed to preserving the estate exactly as it is." The consultant's professional demeanor hid the fact that he was part of the team dismantling Marcus's plans. As they moved through the house, I felt a flicker of hope. The game was shifting, and Marcus had no idea he was already losing. From the morning room, I observed Marcus with a mixture of dread and fascination as he navigated his conversation with the so-called security consultants. He carried himself with the effortless confidence of a man who believed he had already claimed ownership of the estate. His gestures were grand, his voice authoritative, as if he were born to command this sprawling property that my late husband Thomas and I had poured our lives into. Little did he know that these consultants, with their polished professionalism and probing questions, were not here to secure the house, but to unravel his carefully constructed facade. Each word he spoke, each presumptuous order he gave, was being meticulously documented, evidence of his audacity to assume control over what was not rightfully his. My heart raced with a strange cocktail of fear and vindication, knowing that every step Marcus took toward his imagined victory was a step closer to his downfall. The security team moved through the house with a precision that was both reassuring and unsettling. They inspected doors, windows, and alarm systems with an efficiency that spoke of years of training, but I noticed their attention lingered in places that seemed unrelated to a standard security sweep. The study, where Marcus often retreated for his secretive phone calls, seemed to draw their focus. Their equipment, sleek, advanced, and far more sophisticated than necessary for a routine assessment, hinted at a deeper purpose. My pulse quickened as I pieced together the truth. They were investigators, not protectors, and their mission was to expose Marcus's schemes. The weight of months of anxiety, of feeling like a prisoner in my own home, began to lift, replaced by a cautious hope that justice was finally within reach. By evening, as Marcus proudly showed his colleagues the wine cellar, the lead consultant approached me discreetly. His eyes were steady, his voice low and deliberate. "Mrs. Whitmore, our preliminary assessment is complete, and I'm confident you'll find our findings satisfactory. We've identified several vulnerabilities that need immediate attention, and we'll begin implementing enhanced protective measures tonight." His coded words sent a shiver of relief through me. Jonathan, my trusted ally, had promised protection, and now it was in place. The consultants had gathered enough evidence to confirm Marcus's overreach, and the safeguards were active. For the first time since Marcus and my daughter Sarah had moved in, I felt a flicker of safety in the home Thomas and I had built together. That night, I sank into my bed, the familiar creaks of the old house no longer ominous but comforting. Sleep came easier than it had in months, knowing trained professionals were watching, ready to intercept any threat Marcus might pose. The next morning, however, brought a stark reminder of the battle still ahead. Marcus descended to breakfast, his usual swagger replaced by a haggard, restless energy. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his jaw was tight with barely concealed frustration. He thought he was speaking privately to Sarah, unaware that his voice carried clearly to where I sat, pretending to read the newspaper. "The strangest thing happened last night," he said, his tone laced with unease. "One of my business associates called, said his phone was acting up, dropping calls, picking up weird interference. He asked if I was having technical issues." Sarah, stirring her coffee, looked up with mild concern. "That's odd. Maybe the phone system here is faulty." Marcus's response was curt, his suspicion palpable. "Maybe, but those security consultants spent a lot of time poking around the communications infrastructure. They said it was standard procedure, but it felt off." The paranoia in his voice was almost tangible, a delicious irony to me. He was beginning to sense the noose tightening, though he couldn't yet pinpoint the source. His criminal instincts, honed by years of deception, were whispering that something was amiss. But the consultants' professionalism had kept him from recognizing them as the investigators they truly were. Sarah, ever eager to smooth things over, suggested, "Should we call them back to check the phones?" Marcus's refusal was swift, almost panicked. "No, it's probably nothing. We have bigger priorities, like getting your mother settled at Sunset Manor tomorrow." The mention of Sunset Manor hit me like a physical blow. In the whirlwind of activating Jonathan's emergency protocol, I had lost track of Marcus's timeline. He still believed he could proceed with his plan to have me committed, to lock me away in a psychiatric facility where he could plunder the estate unchallenged. The next 24 hours, I realized with a sinking heart, would be the most perilous yet. Excusing myself from breakfast, I retreated to my room, my hands trembling as I dialed Jonathan on the secure phone the security team had provided. "Jonathan, Marcus is still moving forward with the commitment tomorrow morning. How much more time do you need?" Jonathan's voice was calm but urgent. "Eleanor, we have enough evidence to halt the commitment and likely press criminal charges, but we're missing one critical piece. We know Marcus is in deep financial trouble, and we've documented his manipulation of you and Sarah. But we need proof of the conspiracy he's hinted at with outside parties, specifically the murder option. My breath caught at the word murder. The thought of deliberately provoking Marcus into revealing such a sinister plan filled me with terror, but I understood its necessity. Without irrefutable evidence of his intent to kill, he might wriggle free of the financial charges and try again. More carefully, more lethally. "What do you need me to do?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "The security team has planted listening devices throughout the house," Jonathan explained. "Marcus makes his most sensitive calls from the study between 10 p.m. and midnight. Tonight, you need to push him into a corner. Refuse to go to Sunset Manor. Make it clear you'll fight any attempt to commit you." That should rattle him enough to call his co-conspirators and discuss accelerating their backup plan. The plan was simple, yet terrifying. To stop Marcus for good, I had to bait him into exposing the full extent of his murderous intentions. My heart pounded at the thought, but I nodded to myself, steeling my resolve. That afternoon, I called Marcus and Sarah to the living room for what I announced as a critical family discussion. They arrived with an air of smug anticipation, likely expecting me to express gratitude for their care or seek reassurance about the transition to Sunset Manor. Instead, I met their gazes with unyielding determination and delivered my ultimatum. "I've reconsidered Sunset Manor. I'm not going tomorrow, and I won't go voluntarily at any point. If you think I need psychiatric care, you'll have to pursue involuntary commitment through the courts, and you'll need evidence of mental incompetence, which you don't have." The words landed like a thunderclap. Sarah's face registered shock and hurt, her eyes wide with confusion. Marcus, however, paled visibly, his carefully constructed plan crumbling before him. The confident facade he'd worn for months faltered, replaced by a flicker of desperation as he realized his scheme was unraveling. "Mother, you can't just change your mind like this," Sarah protested, her voice trembling with concern. "We've made arrangements. The doctors are expecting you tomorrow." I held her gaze, my heart aching for her innocence in this nightmare. "Then you'll have to cancel those arrangements, Sarah. I won't be imprisoned in a psychiatric facility based on lies and fabricated claims of mental decline." Marcus, recovering his composure, leaned forward, his voice strained but controlled. "Eleanor, you're clearly having another paranoid episode. This erratic behavior is exactly why you need professional help." I didn't flinch. "I'm not paranoid or erratic, Marcus. I'm being targeted by a man who has systematically isolated me from my support network and manipulated my daughter into believing that I'm losing my mind. But I'm not incompetent, and I won't be silenced while you steal everything Thomas and I built." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Marcus's eyes narrowed, his mind racing to calculate his next move. He could try for involuntary commitment, but that would mean court hearings where I could expose his manipulations. He could attempt to convince Sarah I was delusional, but my clarity and specificity undermined that narrative. Or he could activate his backup plan, the one that ensured I'd never reach a courtroom. The cold certainty in his gaze told me he was leaning toward the latter. That night, I lay in bed, fully clothed, my senses heightened to every sound in the house. The security team had assured me of my safety, but the adrenaline surging through me made sleep impossible. Somewhere in the darkness, Marcus was making the calls that would either save me or doom me. At 11:47 p.m., I heard the study door close softly, followed by the low murmur of his voice. The listening devices were capturing every word, building the case that would bring him to justice. But the next few hours were a tightrope walk. Marcus had to remain unaware that his most damning confessions were being recorded. As I lay there, I thought of Thomas, whose love and foresight had armed me with the resources to fight this battle. His memory was my shield, and tomorrow I would honor him by dismantling the man who had tried to destroy everything we held dear. Dawn broke with an eerie stillness. The estate bathed in a quiet that felt almost oppressive. I had spent the night in a liminal state, my mind alert to every creak and shuffle, while my body remained still beneath the covers. At 6:23 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway, careful, measured steps of someone trying to go unnoticed. They paused outside my door, and I held my breath, counting the seconds until the shadow beneath the door moved on. The soft click of the study door followed. Marcus was awake early, a sign that my refusal to go to Sunset Manor had pushed him into desperate action. I slipped out of bed and moved to the window overlooking the garden, where I spotted two figures in dark clothing positioned near the rose bushes. The security team was ready. My phone buzzed with a text from Jonathan. Evidence gathering phase complete. Legal action begins in 1 hour. Stay in your room until we give the all clear. 1 hour after months of psychological torment, of feeling like a stranger in my own home. It would all end in 1 hour. But as I watched the sunrise paint the sky in hues of gold and pink, I realized this confrontation was about more than stopping Marcus. It was about Sarah, whose world would shatter when she learned the truth about the man she loved. Her voice in the hallway, edged with worry, broke my heart. "Marcus, honey, where are you? Mother's door is locked and she's not answering." Marcus's response was measured, designed to soothe. "She's probably still sleeping, Sarah. Yesterday was exhausting for her. Let her rest." But Sarah persisted. "She never locks her door, Marcus, and we need to talk to her about Sunset Manor." The intake coordinator called to confirm the appointment. There was a pause, then Marcus's voice, closer now. "Actually, Sarah, we need to discuss some developments from last night. Meet me in the kitchen. I'll make coffee." His careful tone confirmed my fears. He was steering Sarah away from me, keeping her occupied while he set his final plan in motion. Another message from the security team appeared on my secure phone. Subject made multiple calls between 11:45 p.m. and 2:30 a.m., all conversations recorded. Federal agents en route. Do not leave your room. Federal agents. The weight of those words settled over me. Marcus's scheme was part of a larger conspiracy, one that preyed on vulnerable elderly individuals across multiple states. The thought of how many others had suffered at the hands of predators like him fueled my resolve. In the kitchen, Marcus was spinning a new narrative, telling Sarah I'd had a complete mental breakdown, that I might be a danger to myself or others. He was urging her to call Dr. Peterson for an emergency psychiatric intervention, using her love for me as a weapon. The cruelty of it took my breath away, but I held firm, knowing the federal team needed just a little more time to catch him in the act. Jonathan's voice came through the secure phone, steady and reassuring. "Eleanor, the federal team is in position. We have evidence of Marcus's involvement in a multi-state conspiracy. His financial debts are tied to dangerous people who won't hesitate to use violence. We're monitoring his conversation with Sarah. She's resisting his push for an emergency hold, but we need you to hold out for another 30 minutes. 30 minutes felt like an eternity, but I agreed, asking only that they protect Sarah from the guilt of this betrayal. "She's been deceived by an expert manipulator," I said. "She'll need help to heal from this." Jonathan promised they'd handle her with care. The next 20 minutes were agonizing. Sarah's voice grew more distressed as Marcus painted an increasingly dire picture of my mental state. At one point I heard her sob, and it took every ounce of strength not to rush to her side. But doing so would play into Marcus's hands, giving him the chance to frame my actions as proof of his lies. Then, at 8:15 a.m., a shift occurred. Sarah's voice rose, sharp with defiance. "Marcus, I don't care how worried you are about Mother's mental state. I'm not calling Dr. Peterson to have her forcibly committed without hearing her side. We'll arrange a proper evaluation with multiple doctors, not an emergency commitment based on your word alone." Marcus's response was clipped, his patience fraying. "Sarah, your mother is beyond reason. She thinks I'm a criminal mastermind trying to steal her money. These are signs of paranoid dementia. Delaying will only make it worse." Sarah's resolve held firm. "Then I'll talk to her first. She deserves that." Marcus's refusal was immediate, his tone sharp. "Absolutely not. In her current state, she could become violent." But Sarah's defiance marked a turning point. For the first time, she was questioning the man she had trusted, and I clung to the hope that her love for me would guide her to the truth. As the clock ticked closer to the federal team's intervention, I stood by the window watching the garden and the driveway, ready for whatever came next. The game was nearly over, and with Thomas's love still shielding me, I was prepared to see it through to the end. The air in the house felt thick with tension, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. My heart pounded as I listened from upstairs, hidden away, my mind racing with a mix of dread and fragile hope. Marcus's voice, smooth and calculated, had always carried an undercurrent of control, but now it was fraying at the edges, betraying the desperation he'd kept so carefully masked. Sarah, my daughter, stood at the heart of this storm, her love for me tangled in Marcus's web of lies. I could feel her confusion, her fear, and the weight of the truth she was only just beginning to glimpse. Every word spoken downstairs was a step closer to unraveling the nightmare that had consumed our lives. Marcus's manipulation was a masterclass in deception, and it tore at my soul to hear him twist my love for Sarah into a weapon against me. He painted me as a fragile, delusional old woman, claiming my concerns, my very real fears about his intentions, were the ravings of a deteriorating mind. He'd convinced Sarah that handing me over to his control was the only way to protect me, a lie so blatant it made my stomach churn. Yet, beneath Burgoyne, Sarah's voice broke through, trembling but resolute, and it lit a spark of hope in my chest. "Marcus, you're scaring me," she said, her words heavy with unease. "This doesn't feel like concern for Mom's well-being. It feels like you're rushing her into something she doesn't want, and I don't understand why you're so set on pushing forward without her consent." Those words were a crack in the fortress Marcus had built around her mind. I could almost feel the shift in the air, the first sign that Sarah was beginning to see through his carefully crafted facade. Her doubt, tentative but growing, was a lifeline I clung to as I listened, my hands trembling with the weight of hope and fear. Marcus's response was sharp, his calm exterior crumbling under the pressure of Sarah's questions. "Sarah, I've been shielding you from the worst of your mother's decline," he said, his voice tinged with a desperation that sent a chill down my spine. "She's been making wild accusations, claiming I married you for money, that I'm after the family estate, even that I might hurt her. These are serious delusions that need professional intervention." I felt a surge of rage at how deftly he twisted my truths into lies. My accusations weren't delusions. They were the result of months of watching him, piecing together his subtle maneuvers to isolate me, control me, and seize what Thomas and I had built. He was betting on Sarah's love for him, her trust in their marriage, to make her see my warnings as paranoia. But Sarah's silence stretched on, heavy with thought, and when she spoke, her voice was measured, not swayed. "Marcus, some of those things don't sound entirely unreasonable. You have been managing her calls and mail, and you pushed hard for Sunset Manor despite